What up, y'all? It's the homie Dame. And today, in what will definitely be my most controversial video of all time, we're gonna be tackling an age-old debate in the world of anime. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it and just say it straight up. Is it problematic that anime has so many sexualized depictions of underage characters? In other words, is this moral or not? Notice that I didn't ask if it was legal or not. That's a different conversation, but I'm gonna talk about that too later on. So yeah, this is the question we're gonna be looking at today. We're hopefully gonna end this debate once and for all so that we can all move on with our lives and argue about something else like the ever-present sub versus dub debate, or what the best of the big three is, or if Frieren deserves to be #1 on my anime list. You know, stuff that actually matters. But yeah, like I said, this whole conversation can be a sensitive topic with a lot of nuance, so keep that in mind. I don't think I need to tell y'all that people have a lot of strong opinions on this. But y'all know me, I'm not afraid to dive into the mud. I'm not afraid to talk about the things that people don't want to talk about. Mainly because I'm very dumb and don't think about the consequences of what I do. So here's how this is gonna work. I'm gonna present both sides of the argument, meaning the arguments in favor of the problematic depictions of minors in anime saying that it is moral, and the arguments against these depictions saying that they are immoral. And I'm gonna present them in a completely objective, good faith way that steelmans each side into the strongest form of their argument so that you, the viewer, can decide which side sways you more. Because, you know, again, it's a sensitive topic that people have lots of strong opinions about, so we don't want to misrepresent either side's positions. Then at the end of all of this, I'm going to tell y'all what I personally think, because I do have my own opinion on this. Also, content warning, trigger warning, whatever, we'll be talking about not just, you know, the controversial things like in the topic of our debate, but also SA, abuse, violence, all that stuff. So just a heads up in case you're uncomfortable with any of that. But yeah, anyway, let's get right into it. Before anything else, let's explicitly confirm exactly what we're debating here. We want to know if the sexualized depiction of underage characters in anime is moral or not. Now, notice that there are a few areas to clarify here. When I say underage characters, I mean anyone under the age of consent, which is generally 18 in the US, but it can be 16 too, especially in places like the UK, and also pertinent to our discussion here, in the land of the rising sun, Japan. Next, we gotta clarify what we mean by morality, because if you're like me and you subscribe to the idea that morality is subjective, this can be tricky to like pin down the meaning of, you know what I mean? But to make things simple for the purposes of this video, let's say that we're operating under the general moral framework of a 21st century society that says things like abuse and general human suffering is immoral. Because I know many people are gonna make the argument about cultural differences between Japan and the West that make the moral discussion muddy, but don't worry, we're gonna get to that too. And finally, we gotta clarify what we mean by a sexualized depiction. Because contrary to popular belief, just showing a naked person or cleavage or an ass shot is not necessarily sexual in the way you're thinking. Remember that anime is in fact a medium of art, and art can have risque depictions that aren't necessarily, you know, risque. So for the purposes of this argument, we're saying a sexualized depiction is one that is implicitly meant to be sexually stimulating for the viewer. Basically, your typical idea of fan service, where it doesn't serve any other purpose but to be arousing. Okay, so we have all that cleared up, yeah? Let's get right into the arguments, starting with the pro side, as in the side that says the sexualization of minors in anime is perfectly fine and moral. So let's start out with the most common and, in my opinion, the strongest argument that the pro side has. It's just fiction. It's okay that we show titillating shots of this 13-year-old's panties because, A, it's not real. If you subscribe to the idea of utilitarianism, where the moral weight of an action should be judged based on how much good and or suffering it brings into the world, then the people who argue the pro side will say that the sexualization of minors in anime is a victimless act. No suffering is brought into the world because no real children are exploited or put into inappropriate positions, which, you know, is like the main thing that makes real life CP immoral. And people will say, oh, well, it actually does bring negativity and suffering into the world because these depictions, even if fictional, encourage and normalize a worldview where it's okay to drool over a high schooler in a bunny costume. But if we're continuing on this utilitarianism angle, the argument is that the good that comes out of the art form of anime, even if it's just like, some kind of esoteric spiritual good, outweighs any of those negatives, making it a net positive overall, because you don't have that exploitation of real life children that so strongly would make it a net negative. Like, even if it does create a society where it might be okay to elude a middle schooler, the artistic contribution that comes from the anime makes up for it. It's like a balancing scale or whatever, that's the argument that the pro side would make. But hey, philosophical considerations aside, we really have to hone into the fictional aspect of this. Okay, so say you have a mangaka that creates this big titty waifu character that's built like a porn star, but guess what? She's a first-year high schooler because that's the same age as the protagonist and she's the love interest. Already you have a choice being made here. You create a character and set the age, right? You make a deliberate choice to make this character 15 or whatever she is because that fits the story you're telling and the demographic you want to reach, but she looks like 25 or whatever because you want that sex appeal of a curvaceous, voluptuous woman, which, I don't know how it is these days, but 15-year-old girls usually don't look like this. These are things you could do with a fictional creation, right? It's not like this hypothetical character we're talking about is a real person where we can check their birth certificate and verify their age. They can be whatever age the creator wants them to be, and also whatever age the audience wants them to be. Yeah, I'm sure y'all have seen fan fiction works where people will age up the characters or even age them down in some, flashback alternate universe fanfic. Why not, right? If it makes you uncomfortable that this hypothetical character is 15 but built like a Kardashian, just headcanon it so that they're 37. Again, why not? They're not real. Sure, your version in your head won't be the definitive version, but who cares, right? Compare this to a real life example. Millie Bobby Brown was quite literally a little kid when she first started playing Eleven in Stranger Things. In this case, it'd be weird for you to be all like, well, I can just imagine that she's 25 years old, then it's okay for me to think whatever. Because although the character of Eleven is fictional, Millie Bobby Brown is a real kid portraying her, and she definitely was not an adult in that first season. So sexualizing her in that sense would be immoral, but for an animated fictional character who, mind you, is probably voiced by a grown woman, is not immoral. At least that's all a strong argument that this pro side usually makes. Now, the opposing side might make the argument that under our 21st century morality, the sexualization of minors is always wrong regardless of fictional context. Even if you want to say, oh, this character is only 15 because that fits the story I'm telling, just look at her, she's built like a grown woman, it's fine, it's whatever. You making the deliberate choice to make her younger than the age of consent, even if it isn't real and is just an arbitrary decision, is still immoral. In other words, they're saying that an immoral act is still immoral even if it's done in a fictional setting. But think about this. If you subscribe to the opinion that the sexualization of minors is an immoral act and because of that it's wrong for it to be portrayed in an anime, do you feel the same way about other immoral things? Anime has no shortage of depictions of violence, SA, torture, infidelity, all things that we would consider to be immoral. And yeah, there are stories where these things are portrayed as positive or are celebrated or normalized the way we see the sexualization of minors being normalized. And I know a lot of people make the argument of, well, things like pedophilia and stuff are worse than all those other things, so that's why it's wrong for that specifically to be included in anime. But a bad thing is still a bad thing, right? Would you not want a person who robbed you to be punished because them shooting you would have been worse? It doesn't matter if inappropriate sexualization is better or worse than depictions of violence or whatever, because they're all still bad things. So here's the question again. If you're not okay with one thing, then why are you okay with all the other things? To those of you who happily consume things like Demon Slayer but clutch your pearls at something like To Love Ru, why? This is a segue into another argument I've seen the pro side make. Art is a vessel for us to explore all aspects of the human experience, even the darker parts. To say it's okay to explore mature themes in something like Berserk, but then you gawk at the dangers in my heart for having a big titty middle schooler seems, kind of inconsistent, right? When it comes to art, either all of it is okay or none of it is okay. You run the risk of falling victim to policing art and, these thought crimes where you say this is okay, but this isn't okay. Where do you draw the line, and who gets to decide where that line is drawn? When I was a kid in the 80s, the satanic panic was going on in full swing, and conservative Christian groups all over America were trying to get all sorts of things banned if they included anything they deemed as immoral. Is this a good thing for art where it's so important to be able to openly explore a variety of topics? The pro side would argue no. Now, one final argument that I've heard this side say, which in my opinion is a very weak one, but I want to mention it anyway so that we cover as many bases as possible, is the argument that cultural context is what decides the morality of this issue. In other words, they're saying that Japan views the sexualization of minors differently than the West does. So what appears wrong to Westerners may not be wrong for the Japanese within their cultural framework. Remember that one of the premises that we decided on earlier was that we were operating on a 21st century standard of morality, saying that this type of sexualization is wrong. The pro side would say that this is already a problematic premise because Japan's view on morality is completely different. It makes sense, right? Different cultures believe in different things, so if you're a subscriber to cultural relativism, you can't really knock on anime, which is primarily a Japanese medium, for having Japanese values. Like I said, this is a very weak argument in my opinion, but we'll get into it later because now we can finally talk about the against side of this debate. Before I present any of the arguments that this side has, let's get this out of the way right up front. Sexualized depictions of minors, even in a fictional setting, are technically illegal, at least in the US, and yes, even Japan. I see this argument all the time from people on the pro side. They say, well, even if it's immoral, it shouldn't be infringed upon or looked down upon because it's not like it's illegal or anything. The US has free speech, and that applies to art. Yeah, that's true, but the First Amendment doesn't apply to, child material. That argument might have been the case if it weren't for the Protect Act that passed in 2003, which reads that any inappropriate depiction of a minor, including drawings, cartoons, and even writing, is prohibited. There are also specific CP laws that will specify that it includes virtual or computer-generated depictions of children. But, if that's the case, why aren't people getting locked up for watching Dandadan, or reading Stephen King's It, or browsing not safe for work Avatar smut fanfics? Well, that's because these things fall under the United States obscenity laws and this thing here called the Miller test. To summarize, it basically means that it's prohibited to possess or distribute obscene materials that don't have any artistic merit. How do you decide what has artistic merit? Well, you put it through the Miller test. This creates a very subjective situation, as everyone has different opinions on what counts as obscene and what has artistic merit. Because remember, we're not just talking about CP here. Even saying a good old fuck or shit can be considered obscene. You could technically get arrested for doing that if it's deemed that cursing is obscene, which it used to be. But does that happen? No, not really, because again, it's hard to prove in court because of how subjective it is, but that doesn't change the fact that it could technically be illegal. So if you play around too much and you find yourself up against the greatest army of lawyers of all time, they could argue a way to get you jail time for owning a Blu-ray of Monogatari. But is that likely to happen? Almost certainly no. Unless you're indulging in like the real crazy stuff, and we have seen real life instances where people have gotten arrested for possessing certain, problematic hentai doujins and other things. And like I said, this applies to our friends across the ocean in Japan as well. Their obscenity laws also include drawings and cartoons, which would make it seem like their famous national export is against their own laws. But the key with Japan is that it specifically focuses on the depiction of genitalia. Why do you think all the good bits in Japanese porn are always censored? So long as you don't show the stick in the hole, you can technically argue that your work isn't obscene, even if it's a bunch of dice schoolers. So I say all this to say, all the people on the pro side who confidently argue that they're in the clear legality-wise, while you technically are, you technically aren't at the same time. But yeah, I said I was going to talk about the legality of it just to cover all the bases, but let's move on to the actual moral arguments for the against side. And the first one is addressing the point of cultural differences. Like we just mentioned, even in Japan, drawn or animated child essay material is considered an offense. So already the pro side's argument of, sexualizing minors is, it's okay in Japanese cultural context, so you can't say it's universally wrong to do so, that argument is already on shaky ground. Because sexualizing minors is not okay in Japanese culture the way you think. I know I said I was trying to be objective and non-biased here, but this is something that, grinds my gears specifically because it leans into an unfavorable stereotype of the Japanese people. Japanese mainstream society is socially conservative. The average office worker, grandmother, college student, or middle-aged commuter is not sitting around thinking, oh yeah, look at this voluptuous 14-year-old cartoon character. How, sugoi, how delightful. The average person would react with discomfort or embarrassment, just like in the West, if anything, more so. Like we just mentioned earlier, Japanese law severely penalizes sexual offenses against minors. But this is maybe where the confusion lies. Sexualization of minors is a normalized thing within the culture of anime. Right? The otaku culture, you might say, it's more encouraging of that kind of thing. But this does not mean that these are Japanese values, just because anime is a Japanese medium that is given a little bit of leeway in the legal department. Because the key distinction to make is it's allowed to exist is not the same as people are fine with it. You can absolutely find Japanese people complaining about creepy otaku stuff the same way Westerners complain about, the strange fandoms that we have over here. Because let's be completely honest here, y'all. If you walked up to some random person in Tokyo and showed them a clip from your favorite lolly ecchi show, do you really think that you'd be applauded for your cultural understanding? They just look at you weird the same way people in 1980s America would look at you weird for carrying around your Slave Leia posters after a Star Wars convention. And here's another point we can make. Let's read this comment that I got recently. Fan service and weirdness is a fundamental aspect of anime culture. No wonder otakus have been given that stereotype for years. And if you don't like it, you are a tourist. The Western world is much more sensitive when it comes to these things, and you associating lolicon with pedophilia only proves this point even further. You are a tourist who got too used to Western values. It's true that, like we just said, fan service and sexual content is a big part of anime culture, but it's not something that's inherent to the medium. That's a massive difference. It isn't fundamental like this comment says. If that were true, that would mean that you literally could not have an anime without fan service. And I'm sure any of us could name, a million anime without these things. Is Howl's Moving Castle not an anime because it doesn't have a beach scene with ass and coochie on the screen? The only thing that is inherent to anime as a medium is that it has to be animated. That's all. All these other tropes and things that we associate with anime are a big part of it, let's be honest, but that's not the same as being fundamental to it. So to make these arguments in favor of sexualizing minors because, oh, it's okay in Japan, oh, that's just how anime is. If you don't like it, you're a tourist. These arguments don't really hold up that well. At least, that's what the against side would say. So let's keep on going with this side's arguments against the sexualization of minors by attempting to refute the pro side's strongest argument. Again, it's just fiction. So, you probably have already heard the common rebuttal to, oh, it's just fiction, bro. People will usually say, sure, it's just fiction, but there's real world meaning to what you consume. If this is the case, this leads into that age-old slippery slope debate that we mentioned earlier. If you consume violent media, does that reflect some real world quality about yourself? Like I said, we mentioned how video games are often used as a scapegoat because of school shootings or whatever it is. Was this really the case that violent video games correlated to real life violence? No. It wasn't. So if that's true, it's hard to argue that consuming content that sexualizes minors reflects anything about you as a person in real life in terms of how you will treat real life minors. If an adult sits down and watches 10 hours of gory slasher horror films, that isn't going to turn them into a violent person if they aren't already one. In the same way, a person can binge watch My Dress Up Darling and not have their opinions on women or 15-year-old Japanese girls changed at all. But the against side would say, is that really the case? This side would argue that there's a difference between violent content in media and sexualized content. Think about it this way. What is the purpose of a violent, gory scene in an anime, and what goes on in your head when you watch it? If it's something like, let's say, Attack on Titan, it might be disgust at the horrors of war and genocide, or sadness at the tragic, brutal deaths of beloved characters, or even a sense of solemn resignation at seeing someone, who's heroic dying a hero's death. We would say that these are generally positive emotions that show some kind of artistic merit in what we're watching. After all, art is meant to evoke these kind of emotions in people. Yet, compare that to the beach episode of your favorite anime. What happens when you watch that? What is the purpose? The purpose is to titillate and arouse, and as the viewer, your response is supposed to be titillation and arousal. Like, that's literally the point. Because remember, this whole debate is talking about sexualization without any connection to the plot or anything else. Just pure fan service. Let's take the same route with violent media, yeah? Imagine watching a gore service episode where the whole point is to just show never-ending violence in the most brutal, sickening ways possible. That's a bit different than the violent media we were talking about earlier, no? Now the purpose is to revel in the violence as opposed to look at it from a more artistic perspective. If someone were to actively consume this type of media and take pleasure in it, maybe we would look at them kind of crazy, like, hold on now. And in the same way, consuming media where the purpose is to revel in the sexualization of a young girl, and that's it, yeah, it can raise some red flags. Or at least that's the argument that the against side would make. So it's easy to hand wave things away as just being fictional, but to think that fiction doesn't have some level of impact on the real world is very naive, to be frank. And to think that the media you consume isn't some reflection of you as a person is naive as well, even if it's just a little bit, because I don't think anyone would make the argument that you are solely defined by the media you consume. But I mean, there's a reason we don't let kids watch rated R movies. There's a reason we don't say, oh, it can't be racist because it's just a fictional cartoon. The moral argument isn't about the subject matter, because you can be on the against side and still agree with the statement made earlier in, art, it's either all okay or none of it's okay. But remember, the argument that this video is based around isn't if sexualizing minors is moral or not. The argument is it wrong to depict sexualized minors in fiction? The key word here is depict, because depicting something is different from actually doing it. An artistic depiction of essay is different from actually doing essay in reality. But when we depict an underage character in an anime doing something that's eroticized, that's the action. It's not a depiction of the action. The act of depicting is the thing which is immoral. I'll try and conceptualize this for y'all again. Murdering someone is obviously immoral, but telling someone about a murder that happened isn't immoral. You see the level of separation here between the two different acts? On the other hand, sexualizing minors is immoral, and that's exactly what you're doing when you have a big titty middle schooler on screen. That's the act. There's no secondary action there where you're telling someone about someone else doing the act of sexualizing a minor. That would be the case of a movie like Spotlight, which tells a real-life account of the child essay that goes on in the Catholic Church. Or a movie like Doubt, which gives a fictional account of the same thing. None of these movies are participating in the sexualization or abuse themselves. In the same way, an anime depicting a violent act isn't the same thing as doing it, but depicting an eroticized minor is doing the immoral thing. So going down that line of logic, which, in my opinion, is the strongest argument that this against side can make, you bypass all of the, well, it's just fiction. Because now the argument isn't, oh, watching this anime fan service isn't gonna make you a weirdo pervert in real life. Now the argument is it wrong to create and consume depictions of sexualized minors? It doesn't matter if it's real or not, because it's the act of depiction that we're debating. So if you think it's wrong to sexualize minors in real life, it also follows that it's wrong to create a depiction of a sexualized minor, even in a fictional setting. Because the against side would argue that a real child doesn't have to be harmed for the principle itself to be wrong. But, we talked about sexualizing a minor, but what about consuming a fictional depiction? In other words, is it wrong for you to watch an anime that has an inappropriate fan service scene in it? The against side usually argues, yes, it is. And as for the reason, I think the simple way to put it starting out is, it's just gross. Whether you're just watching an anime with underage characters doing inappropriate things, or you're the one drawing and animating it, it just feels wrong. It feels icky to do. This is called ethical emotivism. Basically, it's a school of thought that says that moral stances don't make imperial claims, they just show emotional attitudes or responses. A.J. Iyer put this in simpler terms when he said that when we say something like murder is immoral, we're really saying boo murder. So when we say watching sexualized minors in anime is immoral, we're really saying boo upskirt shots of high school girls. It's not an argument in and of itself. It's just an explanation of why people feel this way. And if it is true that it does give people this disgusted feeling to watch these depictions in anime, the against side would extrapolate this to say, well, we feel icky even when it's fiction, because it feels weird to partake in something with, I guess, nefarious intention. You, the viewer, aren't the one who drew the weird, ecchi, but you engaging in it by watching is an immoral act on its own, the same way it'd be immoral for you to sit down and watch a racist cartoon. The against side would say that you're supporting this behavior, and even if you literally didn't spend money, you're supporting it in the sense of validating and normalizing this as an okay thing to do. And the fact that it does make people feel so grossed out can be some kind of like internal proof of that. Because consider this. Imagine the most moral person you know. Say it's your elderly grandma that goes to church 5 times a week. Could you imagine her sitting down to watch the Twister scene in Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid and not having like a visceral reaction of disgust, or at least being uncomfortable? Now, you could say that this just means that your grandmother doesn't have the tolerance for that sort of thing, but that's just the point. Different people have different levels of tolerance for fictional depictions of immoral acts, sure, but that doesn't change the fact that all these depictions are still immoral. And the question is why? If depictions and consuming a depiction is not in itself immoral, why do some people have such an adverse reaction to seeing certain things being portrayed, even if they know it's fictional? This goes back to the slippery slope discussion, where if we say this is bad, then this also has to be bad, then this is bad, and either all of it's okay or none of it's okay. But imagine we had the most brutal, graphic depiction of something unspeakably horrible happening to a toddler for the sake of the titillation of the audience. Can we really say that we'd be okay with seeing that, under the lens of, okay, or everything is okay or none of it's okay? If your answer is yes, I have a strong stomach, I'm pretty desensitized, I can handle that, then imagine something even worse than that. And if your answer is no, I'm not okay with, extreme stuff like that, then why would lesser depictions also be okay? Because we can't just say that morality lies wherever your personal tolerance level is, right? So if something is wrong and evokes an emotion of disgust, no matter how little it is, shouldn't all of it be wrong? Depicting is not as bad as doing, but again, that's not the argument. It's not how immoral, it's that it is immoral. When we have that reaction of boo underage upskirt, the against side would say that that means something in terms of our innate morality. And again, that's one of the stronger arguments that this side can make, in my opinion. All right, so those are some of the strongest arguments I've found for both sides of the argument, but now let's talk about what I, the homie Damian, your favorite anime YouTuber, personally think about all of this. Because I've covered some insane series on this channel, both anime and manga, that contain the very same sexualized depictions that we've been talking about this whole time. Here's my personal stance. I think that depicting sexualized minors or consuming content that depicts sexualized minors, even if it's fictional, is, in fact, immoral. But it's like one of the least immoral things you could do. It's definitely wrong because of the principle, but there isn't anyone real that's directly being harmed. But there is harm because of what it can normalize. I personally don't buy any of the it's just fiction arguments, because just like I pointed out on the against side, you wouldn't say that for something you personally find disgusting. For example, the people who are okay with 15-year-old Marin Kitagawa's body being flaunted on screen would be up in arms if Shinichi Fukuda wrote Netorare into My Dress Up Darling. Oh, but why? It's just fiction. Well, maybe fiction can affect us more than we think. But not that much, because I would hesitate to make the argument that we should judge someone off the media they consume. This is a topic that has come up a few times in my hot takes videos, and I've been pretty against it. I don't know, that may be a contradictory stance, but hey, like I said, this section is my personal opinion, and I never claim to be consistent about these things. But look, there's a reason we have age ratings for media. If something is rated R, we would expect it to be too intense for a child to understand. Adults just have more experience, they're more mentally developed, so they can understand these things better because their sense of right and wrong should be better, assuming, they were raised right, As a grown man in his 40s, I can sit down and watch 100 Kanajo and not all of a sudden start getting feral over high school girls, and I don't immediately start objectifying women as sex objects in real life, because I know better. I know what's right and wrong for me, and fictional media is not going to change that, but it might for an impressionable 14-year-old watching the same thing who doesn't know better. So it would be wrong to depict depict and consume these depictions because of the principle, because of what it represents, because of, the fact you're saying that it might be okay to do these things. But like I said, even if it's immoral, it's like the lowest level of immoral. It's about as immoral as stealing a loaf of bread to feed your starving family. It's stealing, and stealing is wrong, but I mean, I get why you did it. It's about as immoral as telling a little kid that their terrible drawing is really good so you don't shatter their confidence. You're lying to them, and lying is wrong, but is it all that bad in this context? I don't know. It's about as moral as supporting horse racing. It's a fun sport and it's entertaining as hell, but it's also very questionable how some horses are treated, and even if it's ethical to breed animals for sport in the first place. And in the same way, is watching To Love Ru wrong because it's wrong to depict minors in sexual situations? Yeah, it is, but you're just watching a TV show at the end of the day, and if you're an educated, well-raised person who is already secure in their knowledge of right and wrong, it shouldn't really affect you. I think it would be ridiculous to judge someone as a horrible, bad person for watching an ecchi anime, just like it'd be ridiculous to say someone who ran a stop sign in the middle of an empty cornfield is worse than Hitler. Both people did something wrong, but it's not like the worst thing ever. Because I'ma be real, nothing is gonna stop me from watching My Dress Up Darling or 100 Kanajo or the beach episode of Bleach or To Love Ru or whatever, or making, raunchy jokes in my reactions. And I don't think it should stop you from watching any of those things either. I think the better thing to do would be to educate yourself on how to not let fiction influence reality. Actually, I had a video about this recently. A lot of people these days, especially anime fans, let's be honest, have trouble separating fiction from reality. This is why you see people developing a fetish for high school girls because they watched some ecchi anime. That's where the immorality comes in, because now there's a negative effect on the world. But if we can learn to not do that as much, maybe things will be better, because then we'd be able to create art that explores a lot more different topics. And as someone who is very pro art, I definitely want to see that. I don't want to see art be suffocated by censorship or the moral police. But that means that the onus is on you and me, the viewers, to show that we're mature enough to handle these sorts of things. Yeah, that's the video. Y'all tell me in the comments which side's arguments swayed you the most, and tell me if you agree or disagree with my personal opinion. But yeah, that's the video. Peace. Oh, I forgot to beg for engagement before the credits. Like and subscribe, and hit up Patreon, where you can find full-length, uncut reactions to completely unproblematic shows like Nukitashi.